There we go. Here we go. Thank you. I just want us to see each other when we chat, but the information is in that note-taking document as well. So in room 1, let's have you guys start and share some of the things that you talked about. What was the biggest thing that took your time?
I can chime in. So we talked about like most recent performance. That was kind of where we started, and we just talked about ELA and social studies that we thought that could work, especially with the types of writing that we continue to practice, that could easily replace some of those grades for the most recent. But then we talked about what would that look like in math, and does that, like, because the content changes so much, that it doesn't seem to like necessarily work for that content. And so we were saying, does that, kind of work everywhere? And then we started just briefly, and then we kind of got cut off, but we were talking about the 50% and just believing that, like, does the 50, if you change the 0 to a 50%, does it give students the wrong message about where they're at in their learning? And so, like, I know that in the book, it talks about, like, the point of changing it to 50 is to like readjust the scale so that instead of like 10 points between an A and a B and a C, and a C and a D, and then 60 points is granted to failure, like we're working on a scale where 60% chance of failure, right? So by giving it a 50, we reestablish it to 10 points between each grade level. But we just talked about, does it still, though, like, to parents, like, unless you're educated like around that, like, to parents and students, it may still look like, oh, 50%, like they still got some of it, like and even if it was like they didn't do anything, I think was some of what our members were talking about. And then I don't know, I'll pass it over to Deb too, because Deb started talking right then. She got cut off about the homework. So if Deb, you want to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, my concern was on the last chapter where they talked about possibly not giving grades at all for formative assessment. And as far as I still knew, even as of last year, I had teachers talking to me about the fact that kids still ask, is it 90-10? And if it's 10, they didn't do anything. Then that was a message to them, oh, I don't have to do it because it only counts 10%. So now if we put something out there that says 0, it doesn't count anything at all, which I understand the reasoning, but they don't understand that, especially middle school students, they don't have that maturity to make that correlation between homework and the summative test, that if you do the homework, it's going to help you on the summative test. They just aren't that mature. And so to give homework as counting as nothing, to me, is a real big mistake.
Any comments or thoughts for group 1?
Like, when I read these chapters, I felt like we already implement so many of these policies at VVSD. So it wasn't like I was reading it as brand new information, but rather, is my practice in line with what this theory is proposing? And just like you said, I mean, if student with the 10% value, even though there's some value, students perceive it as so little that they don't do it. And the author says, they see that by not doing the homework, they are less prepared for the subsequent assessment, and they just they're not making that connection at the high school level even. And I see my students settle for mediocrity. That's the best way I could put it, is that they're not prepared for the test. And then they get the, oh, okay, C is good enough. And I know that they are so much more capable of so much more. And so another of the policies that he mentioned was not giving extra credit. And that's something that we're not allowed to do in VVSD, but I know that the consistency isn't there, because when students ask me, is there extra credit? And I tell them we're not allowed to give extra credit, they seem surprised. So I know that the consistency isn't there, but in lieu of extra credit, I tell them you can redo any of your homework assignments. And some of them really take advantage of that instead. And so we felt like if we were consistent with not, no one can give extra credit, but you can redo any formative assignment. That would really encourage students to value the learning process. Another thing he mentions is like, you don't take off points for late work. We're not allowed to do that. Yet I still see kids cheating, but he's giving me, the author saying, oh, well, like if you don't take off points for late work, they won't cheat because they'll know that they don't have to cheat. They still cheat, so like, I don't know what to do about that either. But we kind of also agreed that there has to be some value put onto homework because we're working with children, and they just don't have our same maturity. But if we allow them to redo it, like then we're taking away the penalty of those mistakes, so that we're not, telling them you have to know it by this day, or that it's wrong if you don't get it right away. Like still give them that opportunity to learn.
I'd like to chime in. I'm a middle school math teacher. I've been in the district for 11 years. And I was talking in our group with Adam, how I've kind of been on all ends of the spectrum with stuff. And I actually was having a conversation with my Block 4 class today about homework. Because we know Hattie's research on visible learning says effect size is 0.29. We literally were looking at it in class today. So like I personally don't believe in homework. I believe in like learning opportunities. And I think what's important is that we know feedback kind of like trumps homework based on his research. So I guess I would, I like look at it from the lens of like what are the opportunities that we're providing for kids in class where they're getting regular going to have impact on them, especially if kids are going home with homework and they don't know how to attempt it on their own. That shouldn't necessarily impact their grade or their overall performance if they don't have the support they need on things that they don't understand. And I also wanted to just share out from the teacher perspective that I continuously give kids things on a day-to-day basis that's worth 0%, and those kids do that work. So I just wanted to make sure that perspective was also heard, because I think it also like we're going to get out of kids what we convince them we believe in. And I've learned that over the years because I had to first convince myself of all this stuff. And once I did that, I found I was able to convince my students of the importance of it, because learning doesn't necessarily mean there's a grade for everything. There's things that along the way when we're learning, there aren't going to be grades for things, because that's part of the learning process in general. And that's just something I've had to learn to convey to my students over the years. So I just want to make sure from my experience, kids do things that are worth 0% from what I've seen. So I just wanted to share that perspective.
And I think I just want to really zero in on one of the points that you made too. So I think part of what we'll need to do as an adjacent to this work is that we have to have a very clear understanding of what homework can be and what it shouldn't be. And so when we say things like we're sending homework home and the kids can't do it, that completely defies the purpose of homework. Homework is intended to be independent practice of something they've already learned. And so one of the things that we know is that because children don't learn things at the same rate, is that if you're giving them independent practice, you don't give it to them until you feel confident that they're ready for that. Otherwise, they're practicing something wrong, and then you've got a lot of undoing to do, right? Which means that kids aren't always necessarily going to get homework at the same time. So you might have a group of 3 students who get something right away and will do that piece of homework at that time, but the others will get their homework when they're ready for it. The other thing is that another purpose for homework is preparation for class for the next day. So there are some things that could happen in homework that might be preparation for the next day. But we have to be very clear on what good homework is and what good homework isn't if we're going to assign it. And so as we continue to build our thinking around what do we put in a grade book for independent work that isn't completed, we have to be thinking, first of all, why aren't they doing homework? And one of the things I can say, and I've never looked at anyone's homework here, so I'm not speaking about anyone in this room or in this district, but I've seen an enormous amount of insipid work going home for homework. Ridiculous work that is not related in any clear way to the learning that is required. Or practicing something 50 times when practicing it 5 times will be enough, or things like that. Now, there's also good homework that's gone home, but we have to be thinking about what we're asking students to do, why we're asking them to do it, and if it has a clear enough connection to the learning that they can see the value in doing it. So, and I say all of that to say that an important adjunct of this work is having a very separate and clear homework committee that's going to be very clear on what homework is and what it isn't and what it should be. So off my high horse there. All right, let's move on to group. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I'm sure that I will not make a few people happy, but with all of our curriculum, there's really not the opportunity to say, okay, these 3 students are ready for the homework and these 5 are not. There's just not that opportunity to do that. So all the kids are getting the same homework. I mean, we don't, and I teach language arts, we don't give homework, but if we were working on something that we taught in that lesson for that day, and they're at the independent part and they didn't finish it, we will tell them, you need to complete it for homework so we can give you feedback tomorrow and move on to the next steps. So we don't, count it as like, okay, you have this homework and if you don't do this, you're getting penalized. But it does add up. If they're not doing those steps prior to the summative, they're not going to know what to do when that summative comes. And we can give that feedback if they're doing it. If they put nothing on the paper, there's no way to give any feedback, because is it that they didn't want to do it? Is it that they didn't understand? I mean, we try to talk with each of our students, but again, with our timing, it's not feasible.
I think you bring up a good point, like to Margot's point about what is valuable homework and then what's not valuable homework, right? Like if you're giving work that's like independent practice that allows you to see what kids know and give them feedback directly, like that's really, really effective homework that's going to have a high effect size towards their learning. And so when kids aren't doing that homework, I think there definitely needs, like you're saying, there's conversations about that. Like we need to be in communication on why that's a value, involving families in that conversation. So I think maybe it's making me think it kind of comes down to like, what is the homework, right? So if it's something like that, whether it's graded or not, like the way you're describing it to me sounds awesome, because you're
Absolutely.
giving it to foster learning,
Right.
not just, basically like, when it's independent work at home just for a grade that isn't really going to get any feedback, that's basically like sending home a test every night,
Mhm.
which is not the same thing as what you're describing now, in terms of like your approach to it. So
Mhm.
I like how you explain that.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, room 2, let's see what you have to share.
Nicole was from room 2.
Yeah, I was from room 2, so I don't know if there was anything more my group wanted to add or that we missed.
Nicole kept telling us that Jamie has
Oh,
going
yeah.
to help bringing practices from the elementary school level, not about necessarily like grades, but around how to collect evidence of kids' performance, like in class.
Yeah, so Jamie, I was like shouting her out over and over again, but she has these data folders with her students, and it just helps them like stay accountable for their progress in ELA. And I had started off the year trying to do something similar with math, but then realized we had like way too much stuff to collect that would fit in a folder. So I just recently transitioned my kids to binders where like it's been a process and I've really had to help them like organize, and every day they like add a piece of evidence to it and they're tracking their progress by the use of a symbol. And so when I give them feedback, it's through a symbol. It's like a check mark means you did it correct on your own with no help. An S means you had a silly mistake. There's communication with them, but I saw the power it had in Jamie's classroom and how her students would come back to her. Like our 8th graders this year came back being like, I want a data folder. I need a data folder. And so I saw just how powerful it was on their learning. And now that I've been trying to do it, it also has had a huge impact on the students taking ownership of the things that are worth like 0%, 10%, and just having all that evidence leading up to a summative. So I just had to shout Jamie out over and over.
Was there anything else from that group that you wanted to share, or was that does that cover?
It was just about Jamie, like the whole time.
Just about Jamie and
Yeah.
how wonderful she is. Well, that's
And how
always.
and how we don't give points for tissue boxes anymore.
Oh, yeah. Good.
We also talked a little bit about like just executive functioning skills.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
And that was a key piece that I personally think is important, you know, just understanding that those developmental stages that our students are going through, it does play a big part in how they're succeeding in the classroom. Are they meeting all of, like if they don't have those skills, it's very difficult to be successful in other areas of academia.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, room 3.
I think the only piece that we really haven't talked about already in other groups was, I'm not sure if I heard anybody bring up the use groups to learn and cooperatively learn, but grades shouldn't come from independent work because we're supposed to be measuring what each student can do, their skill, their content knowledge versus a standard. We're not supposed to be taking it as a group. So if there was like we've talked about, like in the past, if there was this alternate grading scale that included the cooperative learning, then yes, that's where the grade would go, but it would not go into the grades for their achievement or against the standards.
Thank you.
I know that part hit home for me as a parent. Just having that happen to my son in high school, group projects, and you know, like some of the students didn't have all of the platforms that they needed to use to, you know, be successful, and it's just unbelievable.
Absolutely. Anyone else with the thoughts around that? Okay, now group 4, what do you have to share from your conversation?
Melissa and I already spoke, so I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in with anything else that we talked about in group 4.
The only thing that we haven't really talked about is I asked whether or not their future ready time right now is helping with more of those executive functioning skills. So see if it's like helping with like motivation, because one of the things, I don't know your first name. I know it says Della Rosa, so I apologize. Was mentioning was that Michelle, sorry, thank you. Was that like the effort, we were talking about the 50% of like for kids who do nothing versus kids who really try and still earn a 50. And so I was asking whether or not their future ready time right now is working on any of those soft skills towards helping to motivate or teach motivation or teach resilience within the classroom.
So I can speak to that if everybody's okay with that. And Tammy can too, and so can Dorletta. So Jackie, we hope so. That's our best right now. But to that end, the unit 4, which is right after winter break at all grade levels in Future Ready, is executive functioning curriculum. So while it hasn't been in first semester yet, you know, we definitely have talked about setting goals and tracking goals and breaking those down. But in unit 4 will be more specifically, they will learn some cognitive flexibility strategies, thinking about strategies that work for them and how they should try them, and abandoning strategies that don't work. Like if you made flashcards and you studied those flashcards for 3 hours and did poorly on your assessment, don't use flashcards next time. Like, don't go back and reuse those to review. Try something new. So that is definitely something that we are looking at for Unit 4 and hoping to embed within each unit and each part of Future Ready next year. So hopefully TBD, like that we'll start to see that impact.
I'd also like to chime in, and Jamie, I'm hoping you could add to this as well. Yes, the lessons are happening in Future Ready, but at our recent BIT meeting, we discussed and very much so all felt collectively as like teachers that as much as we're doing these things in Future Ready, we have to make sure these things are happening also regularly within our classrooms with our students. So to give an example, like me and Jamie are both 7th grade at Humphrey. And so our 7th grade team, every grade level was in charge of like identifying things that students expressed were needs. And so like in the math classrooms, we've been focusing once a week on mini lessons on positive affirmations. And then like other teachers are reinforcing it. And ELA, Jamie is doing, I think it was calming classrooms. Because we're finding that like, even though kids are getting that in Future Ready, if we're not like embedding those soft skills as teachers in the class, it's going to transfer over. And though we're trying to be more intentional with that. So that's all, I just want to make sure that's considered when we discuss that stuff.
Absolutely.
Adrian, just a quick question. When you said for Future Ready, are you saying all the grade levels, or is that for FRR, FRM, or is that specifically to the Future Ready?
So it is Future Ready core, but as you know, then our priority lessons for Future Ready reading and Future Ready math will be based on that same, not as many, but it's based on the same thing.
Absolutely. All of these also seem are related to Portrait of a Learner. And I think as we think about how critical that is to our work, and we think about the conversations that we've had around our learning and just around our thinking, we've talked many times before about the fact that while a summative academic grade shouldn't include all of these other things, a summative academic grade isn't the only grade a student can or even should get for a course. So can we then wrap in those other skills in a way that we consistently assess them, so that when you receive a math grade, you're receiving an academic grade as well as either Future Ready or Portrait of a Learner or those kinds of things. And I know I've told you before that there are a lot of places that would love to see that on a transcript. I've had conversations with some of those folks because they believe that that's more important than their academic grades. So I think that that's something that we want to really make sure that we consider. And while I wasn't planning to do this necessarily at this time, this conversation lends itself to a video that I've been wanting to share with you at some point. So what I'm going to do now is share this video clip with you, and I'm going to put you back into rooms to briefly talk about, again, on our notes, we have some of our key points that we want to, either questions we want to ask our colleagues or points we want to include in our share outs with them. So I'm going to share this screen with you. This is part of a series that was on PBS called The Future of Work. And it was a panel discussion with young adults who had recently begun working in the work world, either post-high school, post-secondary schooling, or post-college, things like that. And this is at the end of that panel where there were some questions from the audience. And so this is the key piece of this that I wanted you to see that I think has a direct impact on the things that we're doing.
So next we have a question from Shelley. What specific workplace skills do you feel high schools should focus on to be best prepared for the workforce? Okay, let me dissect that a little better. Okay, so what do you think high schools should focus on so that, you know, students are best prepped for the workforce? So I want to start with Jordan with this.
I definitely feel like effective communication is definitely needs to be more focused on, especially coming from a high school level. Knowing how to speak to different people and kind of self-advocate at times is extremely important in the workforce, especially like as soon as you're coming out. Like they may choose to go to college or pursue a trade afterwards. No matter what, that effective communication is going to be a #1 skill that they're going to continuously use. And I feel like a lot of the times, I know at least when I first had my first big like adult job, I felt like it was very difficult to not only communicate with my coworkers effectively, but also the leadership as well. That's kind of something that I had to learn like kind of from experience. And so I feel like coming out from school, that's kind of like one of the qualities that I feel like that they should kind of like harp on a little bit more because it's so important.
Right. Okay. Catherine, do you have anything to add to that as far as what do you think high schools should have in place to prepare students for the workforce?
Yeah, this might be a little bit of a hot take, but I actually don't think that high school should be focused on preparing their students for the workforce. I don't think that education should be structured with the goal of, you know, getting students jobs. I think it really should be focused on making our youth well-rounded, well-adjusted, compassionate, you know, community-involved folks. And I think as part of that, like I would love to see high schools focus more on critical thinking skills and being able to challenge, you know, the status quo, being able to, you know, be a free thinker and bring that into the workforce so that we're not just getting a bunch of folks that are sort of complying with, you know, whatever's been going on, but sort of paving a new way and being able to really shape the future of work.
Wow. Okay. I really enjoyed that. I didn't know where it was going at first, but I love it so much. Like, I love it so much because whenever we're centered and we're great within ourselves, we can be great at anything we do. So I really appreciate that one. So Sarah, do you have anything to add to that? Or as far as like, or what are your own personal thoughts about, you know, high schoolers being prepped for the workforce?
Oh man, it's hard to follow up Catherine's answer because I was trying to think of what skills I learned in high school that prepared me for medicine. And honestly, I couldn't think of a single one. I don't think I remember anything from my physics class or my chemistry class that I use on a day-to-day basis. But I think fostering a sense of curiosity, passion for learning, just, you know, interest in lots of different things, being able to communicate your, you know, thoughts and emotions and experiences with other people. I think that's what really high school should be about. And I think those skills are applicable to whatever you might choose to go into, rather than having like concrete things that you must learn before you leave high school.
So first of all, my first thought was, well, we do some of those things. Maybe you just weren't quite as actively engaged during that. But I'm going to put you into your breakout rooms now and have you then follow up on just this piece in conjunction with what we read together and how that might impact our thinking about how we're providing feedback and assessment grades to students. Okay, so I'm going to give you about 15 minutes for this conversation. Okay, so let me get that set up for 15 minutes and let me get you into your rooms.
Margot, we're going to different rooms now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I just didn't understand that.
I should, yeah, sorry, I should have said that.
I got another meeting for an hour. This assessment one. Yeah, that's all right.
Hi, Said. I'm going to put you into a breakout room. They'll fill you in on what we are doing. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Margo.
Yep. No problem.
Everything else. But maybe Margo can answer that a little more. So Margo, I just said, like, what power do we as an educational system have to like kind of push back on the amount of learning standards we need? Because grades are based on the learning standards, yet all of these experiences are not, like, they're based on your relationship, your communication skills. Like, how do people find that balance?
I mean, I think
and
that it can
have
be,
kids graduate.
I think that it can be pretty seamless in the classroom. I mean, I'm a CICC at Martinez Middle School, and I have a cohort where I'm, working very closely with our second and third year teachers, like overall to the classroom. And we just recently talked about different types of feedback, and we talked a lot about, yes, there's space for task feedback. There's space for kind of your protocol, your routine feedback in your the content feedback that if I'm talking about a specific learning standard, but then there's room for self-regulation feedback. So we can, and that's kind of, I think what Nicole was speaking to a bit was, how do we seamlessly kind of provide that type of feedback in the classroom that's not just about the academic content standards, but also about those soft skills. And I think it's critical in middle school and high school to not only give feedback on the content, but also how students are accomplishing those things. So if it's just even something as simply as, hey, what would be really helpful right now is if you're gonna write these notes down, and is that not working for you? Let's figure out a different thing. And it's not necessarily a standard that we're teaching to, but it's a soft skill that we're teaching to that then gives even more value and weight to what they need to be successful in the content. And I think a lot of times, especially in secondary, we get so focused on content that we lose all of the stuff that we need to do to build effective, not only learners, but people outside of their secondary education.
Now that I think about it, I notice those types of things on IEPs a lot. Like when teachers send me things like, I need updates on goals. And a lot of them are social emotional things. Like you just said, like self-advocacy. And in a way that I don't take the time to do this like on a regular basis in my gen ed class. But then there comes, like, I get the IEP update meeting and I have to like, okay, let me answer these questions. How often does this kid self-educate or whatever? And it's one of those things where it's almost like, yeah, everybody needs that.
I've always said that if we did for our gen ed kids what we did for our sped kids, it would be awesome. What the transition specialists do with kids in high school, etc. it'd be wonderful.
Because I think we typically look at it as a formal, like executive functioning skills and all the work that Adrienne and their team are doing, which is going to be great. But then how does that translate into the classroom and remain consistent in it? Because if it's a one and done, teach me about self-care as a teacher, great. If I don't actually do that, it doesn't matter what I do. So how we consistently keep that in the classroom, I think, is a big goal that we should have. Especially, I mean, the younger they learn it, the better they'll be when they're all the way up, in high school.
And I think the main thing that, whether they're in first grade or 12th grade, the base of all of that, and people may disagree, but I think is accountability, to show that in order for them to learn how to take and be an advocate for themselves, or say this isn't working for me, they have to know how to be accountable for choices and decisions, and understanding X plus Y equals Z. So if I don't do X and I don't do Y, I'm sure not going to get to Z. So, we are always trying to, whether it's through our RAM activity or other lessons, talking about that accountability and how to make sure that they are aware of what they need to do in conjunction with us as the teachers, like how to make sure that they're doing what they need to on a daily basis. Because
Michelle, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, do you find that it's easier, that accountability piece is easier?
Hard for a child who does struggle to learn, and then finding like the school can only do so much support within a day. So like, where else then can we make up that learning?
People talked around like that soft skills conversation, and then Tammy had mentioned that it really is being called employability skills, which then connects to that video, right? And they didn't want to talk about, focusing on those skills. And then I think about our portrait, where are we thinking, reflecting, and embedding through this assessment for accountability group, an empathetic citizen, a critical thinker, an adaptive learner? Like, where do those pieces come in? Because we don't want them part of the grading process, but like, if we don't have them at the forefront, they're going to be things on a piece of paper and not lived experiences for our students.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Like, you don't want it to just be a checklist.
Right. And I would sit, and I hated history, and I had one teacher in high school. His name is Dan Larson. And the man in US history would like have sweat rings under his arms. And like, I remember the day he talked about FDR, he came in a wheelchair, and he's like wheeling around the room. Like, this man made history so exciting for me. And the only part of history that I can sort of talk about is US history. And it was all about how he presented the material, not anything else. He could have been talking about like World War I, and I would have loved it, but because it wasn't about what he was presenting, it was about how he was presenting. And so I see you smiling. So Michelle, I know you, I'm thinking as I'm hearing you guys say curriculum, but I would argue like that what you guys do day in and day out is really what is is meaningful for kids, no?
Well, I think I think that at least from the high school perspective, what I've heard is that the curriculum is so consistent between teacher and written to do the same exact thing, that the autonomy of the teacher has been removed. Some
Ah,
of my teachers don't even enjoy teaching anymore because they,
so you can't get the sweat rings because you feel like you're like, I have to say this on day A and I have to say this on day B. Thank
Well,
you.
And not
so
only that, but like, why get sweaty about it? Like,
it's not worth it.
yeah, like the pieces that I feel like my students have, like their energy is high. It's some of those supplemental pieces that I have provided. And I wouldn't be the teacher that would come in the wheelchair, but I definitely would put things in front of my kids that would get them having that conversation and talking about it and questioning just to find out about each other or this new culture, this new idea that's being presented.
So it's not like it's the curriculum. I feel like what I'm hearing, and Jackie, thank you for helping me to understand. And I did not mean to make this time about me because that feels terrible. But it like what I'm hearing is it's the curriculum is bland and dull, and you don't feel like you have the ability to get the sweat rings and go outside of the box.
They say we do, so I saved an email and I'm gonna tattle on myself. I'm currently teaching a novel study because I'm supposed to be teaching a short story that requires the kids to continue a story on. And the students don't even understand the story because it's about a marriage and how a husband and wife had secrets from each other and it caused issues in their marriage. 7th graders do not understand that, but I can take a novel that they're interested in and stop in the middle and have them write the next chapter and get much more engagement. So I feel more energized this week. My kids are so excited. I had a kid who misses a few days a week every week, and he's been at school Monday, Tuesday. And at the end of class today, when he left, he said, I can't wait to hear tomorrow what we're going to read.
Isn't that
like,
awesome?
I needed that as much
Yeah.
as the kids did.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what Michelle and I are struggling with the most. Like, if we want to give good grades and good feedback, we also need to get them.
One of the things we were trying to brainstorm around is like, if homework isn't the ideal scenario to teach them those things, because it's potentially problematic, like how else can we make sure that we teach them those things? And make them valuable in maybe a different context than homework. To your point, Deb, that like if they leave with the message that those things aren't important, that isn't really preparing them for success. So like, what are different contexts over like the 13 years that they're with us that were very consistent at like a developmentally appropriate way of saying like, responsibility is important. Coming to school every day is really important. Caring that you do well is really important. Doing work is important because hard work leads to success. Like those kinds of messages. If we can't, if the research is saying that with homework that can be problematic for some kids, there's got to be other ways that we can make sure that we're being really intentional about that message and not just forgetting about it and kind of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And I have my own opinions, but I think like this whole group is a great, place for people to come up with some of those examples.
I felt like every time I walked into a room, it got quiet. So
Yeah, that was, it's interesting to hear other people's viewpoints.
absolutely. Hi, Karen. Welcome. We're just coming out of breakout rooms.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
5 seconds. All right, welcome back. I felt like every time I visited a room, it got quiet. So I stopped visiting rooms because I wanted you to have open conversation. This puts a slightly different lens on some of the conversations we've been having. Please make sure to capture your notes into the second chart on our note-taking document. The title says key questions for discussion, but it's okay to just capture those thoughts there. So you were in different rooms. So let's hear some of the thinking that you had. And this pushed some buttons a little bit, and I'm thinking, yeah, that we don't all agree on some things, and it's good to have those conversations and to surface those things and get to a place where we can begin to understand how all of these things come together in our work. So it's good that we had some open disagreement and discussion in the rooms. So let's start with room 1 again.
That was us. We were trying to like jot things down all at the last minute. We had some good conversations, so I know we didn't capture everything.
Okay.
But I think just like one of the big things that came out of in our conversation that we kind of noticed is like as we were talking, we continued to ask like why are things happening? So like instead of like assuming negative intentions about our students, like we found ourselves continuing to be like, well, why are they not doing this? Why are kids not doing homework? Why are kids cheating? Why are kids this? And then instead of putting like blame on kids, trying or penalizing kids and punishing them for these things, looking for like a solution or a way, or identifying like what is the skill that is lacking, the need that is lacking, the relationship that is lacking, to then shift the dynamic to get them excited about learning, get them excited about whatever. So, and then ways to build those things into our academic settings that were like similar from the video. So.
All right, room 2.
You guys want me to try? So I think, Nicole, to build a little bit, like because I think building on what you just shared, we actually talked about curriculum a lot, and really this notion of how do we bring curriculum into this conversation, because we need to make sure and explore whether or not our curriculum is going to produce the desired outcomes for student achievement. And if anyone has any more specific questions about what that means, I feel like my team members will do a better job explaining. I'm trying to summarize.
Can someone, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. I was only in there for part of that conversation. So can we talk a little bit more about your conversation around curriculum?
We were just talking about in terms of making sure that the curriculum is relatable, equitable, and we just had different perspectives of like the provided curriculum and whether or not there's autonomy to really make it unique per teacher or per unique for each, student that the unique class that they have in that day, just because it's a little bit more scriptive. And so that's where we were talking about, it's hard to talk about a grading process or grading structure when the curriculum might need work first.
And I think part of what you were talking, well, what I heard when I was in there for just a couple of minutes, you were talking also about feeling that making connections, authentic connections to real life felt a little more difficult to do because of how the curriculum is written and what the expectations are, that perhaps hands were tied a little bit in terms of building in some of that authenticity and creativity in how we teach what we teach. Did that accurately capture what you were saying? Okay.
I think as the specific example, Margot, that you heard was that one of the teachers indicated, you know, like a book that she was, or a short story she was supposed to read. I think it was a short story with the class. She didn't feel like the class could relate due to the makeup of the class. And so if she, when she used a different piece like of material, the kids were super engaged and excited. And the kid even said, I can't wait until I see you again to see what happens next. Just because the tool that she was supposed to use to teach the lesson wasn't, like Jackie had said, like the kids couldn't relate to and couldn't interact with.
Thank you. All right, room 3.
One of the first things we talked about was, like, we agreed with a lot of what the video said about how, like, the soft skills, the communication skills, executive functioning, and relationships between students and teachers were probably the most important things that students get out of school. But we found it, I don't know, contradictory or ironic that the things that they're actually graded on are these standards, and just sort of how do we bridge that gap between the things that we're supposed to teach for the curriculum versus these other really important aspects that impact, you know, whether or not they can learn those standards.
I heard that in several groups. Hey, group 4.
That was us. We talked about basically the connection with the portrait
Mm-hmm.
of the learner competencies, and how, like, what we're calling habits of work or approach to work or whatever really are to us, they're the portrait competencies basically. And then we also had a conversation about whether it's with homework or elsewhere, how do we ensure that kids are learning the value of, you know, being consistent with their work, working hard, persevering through work, having stamina, you know, meeting deadlines, those kinds of things, as those are readiness skills too. So if the, you know, in the book study, it says maybe homework isn't the best place to teach kids that, even though it seems pretty germane, but maybe homework isn't the best place to make sure kids develop those competencies. What are the other places we could make sure that they're going to develop those competencies? If it's not connected to their grade, there's got to be other ways that we can get that message through and assess kids on those skills without missing out on that opportunity and really setting them up to kind of to fail if we're communicating a different message to them.
Right. We have to remember too that this is a vertical conversation, which is why we have elementary people here, because these soft skills start in kindergarten, preschool even, and that we have to really be thinking about how are we building these in more intentionally, so that when we're getting to some of this more difficult content or content that students feel less connected to, that their approach to learning and their belief in themselves as learners has been built more strongly when they were younger, so that they have the ability to be more open around learning things that they don't quite see the connection to yet. But that's a very long process to build what that looks like from elementary up. Great conversation. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that's, we had briefly kind of touched on in our group. I think by the time that students get to secondary, and especially, you know, when they start in 6th grade and move up into high school, those soft skills we often forget to give feedback on in classrooms. So I think, like what Nicole had mentioned earlier, that her and Jamie, like, they're giving consistent feedback in class about how to use those skills to make connections and be motivated in the work. I think we just kind of steer towards focusing all feedback and assessment solely on academics, and then we kind of lose that importance of those soft skills as they get older.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, by the time we get to that secondary level, the soft skills should be about we're refining them rather than teaching them initially. And then it becomes something that we use, it's how we teach and engage students in their learning and really reinforce it from that. But I think that first young adult who spoke talked so much about communication and self-advocacy. And when we talk about self-advocacy, that's a hard thing to start doing when you're 13 years old, right? Because we know how they are at that middle school age. Thank you for this great conversation. We could spend
very
hours
brief-
doing this. Yeah, sure. Go ahead,
Can I
Dorla.
very briefly? I had gotten a LinkedIn article that talked about 41 big ideas that will change the world in 2023. And number 11 was the school to work plan will be turned on its head. And it talked about where many of the requirements for jobs are changing to have less education. And as a result, oh, that's not as a result, but you have, I think, over 1.3 million fewer students in college than what you had pre-pandemic.
Right.
And it said that working has long been seen as a side gig while students earn a degree. Maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe working is core and maybe learning is the side gig. And so these kinds of ideas will impact how we prepare our students for the next step. So I'll get the link and I'll put it in the chat if anyone is interested in looking at the article.
Absolutely. Thank you. I hate to just stop abruptly, but we have a few things we really want to get done in order to stay to our timeline for getting some things to the board. So I'm going to shift now, and we're going to shift into talking about board policy. And so one of our first charges here is to make a recommendation to the school board about an updated policy around grading. So just to give some background here, this is actually the definition of what school board policy is. So it's basically the rules and guidelines that help an organization reach its long-term goals. Okay, so policies are really about how we do how we run as an organization. Administrative procedures are established to implement the policy. So the policy is the guideline for what we do. The administrative procedures are some specific steps as to how to get there. And as we mentioned briefly in a couple other meetings, is that administrative policies do not have to be in a policy book. When anything is put into a board policy, it requires school board review and approval. Sometimes procedures make small changes, and then before they can be implemented, they need to go through board approval. That's not necessarily an efficient way to use time. And often school boards are not really necessarily they're not as concerned with the procedures that we're following to achieve the policy. They just want to make sure that the policy is being implemented as intended. So we want to be thinking about those things. So again, generally in most cases, but not all, administrative procedures are developed by the administration without the approval of the board. But the board may direct that a specific procedure be submitted for approval. So that is under the purview of the board. In the 20 years I've been at board meetings and working with board policy, I've never once seen a board request that, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It can absolutely happen. So again, here we look at local school boards come from state legislators. We have ISB, which is the State Board of Education, which also has to follow expectations from the federal government, from legislature, and so on. So when we look at school board policy follows a very specific format. So each section follows, includes a specific type of policy. So section 1 of any board policy in Illinois, except for CPS, which we almost always say except for CPS, and parts of CPS does follow this, is all going to be about school board or school district organization. Section 2 is all going to be about how the board works. When we look at section 6, that's the one that we specifically are going to be looking at, because that is about teaching and learning. That's the instruction piece. There's some other pieces on students that we'd look at. There's some personnel things, all of that, but section 6 is where we're going to be specifically looking. And then when you look within those sections, each section has numbered portions that are related to a specific part of that. So for example, when we look at section 2 under Board of Education, every school district in Illinois that has a school district governance policy, their policy is numbered 2:10. Any district that has a policy on powers and duties of the Board of Education and indemnification, that's addressed in policy 2.20. So there's a very specific organizational structure to how a board policy is organized. Now, much of board policy is based on school code, school law, and case law. So the way that works is that, first of all, let me just go through all of this. A board policy has a policy number and title, so you can see any district that has something called school district governance is called 2:10. You're going to have the text of the policy underneath the title. You're going to have also a legal reference if there's a reference to school code law. And then when you look at school code or school law, this is the structure of how school law is written. So there are, you can look at like ISB and look at what the school code is. There are printed manuals of school code. You can just look up what is Illinois school code. And this is how school code is organized. So that's what structures and gives guidance to what the policy has to include. Okay. Then when you look at cross references, these are references of other policies that are connected to this one. So for example, when we look at policy 2:80, which is the board member oath, it is related to the governance policy. Okay, so you can see all of these things and how they're related. So there's a complexity to it, but it's a predictable complexity. And then you'll see whenever the policy was updated. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. Does this all make sense so far to the level you need it to make sense? Any questions or anything? Okay. All right, so now there's a publication that is available to those of us in Illinois, and there's other states that have this too, and it's called PRESS. And to be honest, I can't remember what PRESS stands for, but PRESS is an organization that works with attorneys who are experts in the area of school law and case law. And so for those of you that are not familiar, case law is when a piece of legislation is questioned in a court case. So a court case eventually gives an interpretation to what the law was intended to do. So then the case law is an updated way of looking at the legislation and having a clearer interpretation of what that means. Okay, so what PRESS does is they send out a monthly update to school districts that subscribe to it, where they'll say, here's this policy, and this is the case law that has occurred that you should be aware of. And then these are the recommendations we make for any updates to your board policy. Now, they don't do it for every single policy in the policy book every month. They do it when it happens. They also make recommendations for how frequently you should update different kinds of different policies related to different things. Okay, so they will redline things if they need to be removed. They will add information if it needs to be added. But what the point I wanted to show you here is that here is their recommendation for an updated grading and promotion policy. The reasons and then the rationale behind that is all listed down here. So you can see that state law requires districts to have a policy containing the reasons for which a grade may be changed. And that's the reference to that policy. And then it also talks about if we used weighted grades, what we need to do. And then the second one is another legal interpretation. Absence a court order to the contrary, upon the request of a parent or a student whose parents are divorced, copies of report cards, blah, blah, blah. So you can read all this, but I just wanted you to see that there are things here then that are updated since legislation or the most recent publication of school law books that these are things that we need to be aware of when addressing law or policy. So you can see that there's a lot that is prescriptive about school board policy. Okay, so that said, what we are going to be looking at is policy 6.280, because in every district in this state, except CPS, 6.280 is the policy number that is related to grading. And that is this one. So this is the press recommendation, the most recent press recommendation around what your grading and promotion policy should include. So you have the text of this in the PDF of this slide deck that I shared with you. So what I'm going to have us do is when you go into our folder here, where's the folder? Oh, I'm on the wrong one. Where's our folder? There it is. So when you go into our folder and you go to our December 6th meeting, you're going to see a bunch of different policies in here. So what you'll see is this is the Berwyn one. This is ours. This is our current policy. So you'll be able to see all of the text on our policy. Then you're going to see Berwyn's policy. Probably looks familiar. Then you're going to see Burr Ridge policy, and I tried to select districts that were in close proximity to Valley View. Probably looks familiar. Okay, so now we're going to look at Naperville policy. Oh, hey, that looks familiar. I've also got Rockford Public Schools in here. They've added a paragraph in the middle, so they've added something. Now, what I'm going to have us do, and we don't have a ton of time now, it's 5:10, but I'm going to give us a little bit of time. I'm going to put us back in groups. What I'm going to have you do is take a look at those policies and then take a look at ours. And then if you want to look up other policies from other neighbor districts that you know, like where your kids go to school or anything like that, I want you to take a look at that, because I don't want you to think that I did anything to just hand select a policy that I thought would, that would be good for us, because I don't have a preference for what that looks like. That's up to you. So I want you to just take about 10 minutes in your group to take a look at these board policy samples, at the press recommendation, and that any other ones that you might want to look at, and then just come to some conclusions around what you think makes sense for us in our board policy recommendation. Make sense? Okay, I'm mixing you up into different breakout rooms again. I'm going to open the rooms. I'm going to give us 10 minutes to work on this. It's not a ton of time, but we'll add more time to our next meeting when we get ready to make our final recommendation between now and then. So we'll have more time if we need it. Okay. All right. Everybody have access to the folder and what you need to do. All right. 10 minutes. Oh, Karen, I need to assign you to a room. Sorry.
Yeah, and I left to pick up my kids and came back. So
all right. So I'm going to put you in a room too. Sorry about that. All right. Now you've got rooms.
In our policy, in that it's almost like less is more, because with the first line, the superintendent shall establish a system of grading that gives you the flexibility to continue to update your grading system, like your superintendent, to do that without having to go to the board every single time, because it's kind of a blanket statement that the superintendent would establish that, if I'm reading that correctly.
I agree. It's a vague statement that allows us to make changes on the fly as we see, that allows us to follow best practice and research that comes out. So it
right?
Yes.
Margot, I feel like you came in like right at the right time when I was done with my sentence.
Yeah, this one is very specific where the other one doesn't really talk about how you're grading.
No, and like as someone in special education who deals with attorneys and like things all the time, the more specific, like the harder, right? The more broad, then it makes better sense. Because it doesn't pin us down to like really specific things.
And
I'm
I do
being
think
recorded.
that.
What?
Yes. And I do think that because we're trying to build a multi-phase process over several years, not having to go to the board to approve every specific piece of the pieces as we phase them in would be helpful, particularly because they wouldn't have the background that we're building for ourselves as we make these decisions.
Well, and over the next few years, we could anticipate some board changes because there are board members who have said that they're not necessarily planning to come back. So
Do you know, are any of these unit districts?
Yes.
204. Is it Naperville 204 or 203?
Let me look at that folder again. I can't remember.
I can pull it up. I just thought
it's
maybe you knew off the
203.
top of your head.
It's on the bottom. It's 203.
203 is still a unit district, isn't it, Jackie?
RPS is a unit district as well. But in the region, I looked at the map just to look at districts. There aren't a ton of unit districts within a close radius, but when you look at the bigger districts that are outside, I pulled a couple from different places, but you can find any throughout the state. Just don't look at CPS. It's a mess.
Yeah, 203 is a unit district, Jackie. I thought it was. I know 204 is because I live.
Pull on January 5th, let's call it. Their
Okay.
grade changes 2 weeks later because they did that assignment that
Okay.
they didn't do in October. So like that's
Or
what
maybe
it's
it's-
to me.
yeah,
is
maybe it's a
with
summative-
recovery. That,
yeah.
And so we typically only do it for if your grade is a 50 or above. Like if you've got like a 45, those students need to do, extended day or retake it the next year. So that's what it sounds like.
Thank you.
Adrian, which one were you talking about? I'm sorry, I was reading, so I didn't hear the first.
You're right. So I have pulled open the one that says RPS, so I don't know who that's from, I guess. But there's a bullet point that talks
Rockford
about
Public Schools.
okay, that
I was
makes
looking
sense.
for unit districts.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's just a bullet point in there that talks about like why a grade may be changed by administration, and it says like the student doing extra work. So I was just that felt like it somewhat contradicts where we might be headed, but I know that we don't have to, we're not saying this is the policy we're adopting. It was just something I noticed.
I
Right,
wanted
no,
to
I
show an
agree.
example where someone made a tweak to the press recommendation that didn't become as big as ours.
I noticed like a difference in a couple of them, like some say the administration shall determine remedial assistance for a student who is not promoted, and then other ones say for a student who is not meeting like performance standards. So that was kind of interesting to me. Like if it's when they're not promoted, like I feel like that's way too late, obviously.
And that speaks to our MTSS system too.
But the way we grade with 90-10 plus the 25, the anxiety it puts on kids and teachers, quite frankly, in getting kids ready for the final is like really counterproductive to their learning.
Not to mention just the high stakes for the validity and reliability of the final, which is hard as an admin to have a pulse on all the different finals for all the different content areas, in good faith to say, yep, this is something that I feel good should be 25% of a kid's grade. That's really tough.
Plus, that's the only test they can't retake too, right?
Right. And Deb, you got to tell me, and I really think you're going to agree with me. It has always bothered me that our grade 90-10 with 25% being a final, that being 125% has always driven me nuts.
Mathematically.
Yes,
Mathematically,
yes, it has always driven me crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, so I did some searching while I was listening. And I checked out the 3 schools that are closest to where I live, Canelan, Sycamore, and DeKalb, and every single one of them is exactly what Press had. I just wanted to share that real quick.
The one thing I would like to add to ours, like if we started with Press, just as a starting point, I think the non-negotiables we've put together or some form of those would be an interesting thing to discuss adding to ours. Because there's things in there about like protections for teachers, being able to implement, having time, that it's realistic, the equity aspects, some of those, that it communicates an accurate grade, because it would basically like, we can tweak the procedures here and there, but it would box in anyone from doing something crazy. Like we make a full standards-based report card for high school, like teachers can't do that. It's not gonna work. There's too many standards. The standards are too complicated. So it would limit, I think it would make teachers feel better, you know, just to see like that stuff is in the policy. We're not just saying that's how we think of it, but it's actually like part of the policy. But it's not so specific that we can't make tweaks within that box when we need to. Since I've been communicating this to people, I go back to the non-negotiables every time. Like I was talking to Renee and Jared about it today. Maria and I were talking to Renee and Jared, and just kind of like the non-negotiables were a really good way to show them like the work the committee has done. Basically, like we've arrived at this, like we don't agree on everything. We don't have like a concrete proposal for exactly how much formatives are going to count or whatever, but we have come to a consensus on these things that we cannot do anything if it violates any of these non-negotiables. Which puts us well further ahead in this conversation than we've ever been. Because Deb, like a lot of the conversations like you and I have had them, I know you and Jim had them. The conversations around like what we want to be non-negotiable or we prioritize occurred like in places, right? But never all.
Some flexibility that can be out there as well.
Yeah. And whatever that looks like it's hard because like we want students to understand what those levels mean. And I still feel like, I mean, we know right now, like kids know what an 85 means. Like they know it means proficient, but they know it also means it's a B. So like kids are still focused right now on just like, it's still not where we want it. But then when we move in that direction, like we can't just like, it can't just be a word. Like there has to be understanding to it. It has to like really have value and meaning and be student friendly, like in a language that is understandable for them.
Yeah. And it's like,
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're just going to do a brief conversation. We only have a few minutes left, but I just want us to have a brief review of the big ideas that came from each of your groups. So let's start with group 1. What was your conclusion about all of this?
I'll speak up this time because I feel like Nicole's had to talk every time. She can chime in if she wants to.
Thank you.
We really talked around less is more is what we were kind of seeing from the different perspectives. And then being able to, when I've been in the different groups listening to people, we've talked about how sometimes things work for the CTE department or competency-based works for some. So like wondering how we could meet every curricular area or level, middle, high, elementary, with what works best for those areas if it was something done outside of board policy, was kind of the conversation what we had in our room.
And we also talked about like whatever we communicate out to students, like the less is more. Like I want to just like highlight that because somebody was saying it earlier, I forget who, but just about like even thinking when kids are transitioning from elementary to middle school and then they go from proficiency to then like navigating all these different teachers' classes, like whatever gets reported to students has to be like student-friendly language, simple, clear, easy to understand. And especially when teachers are reporting grades or information to kids like on Infinite Campus. If you've ever tried to watch a kid navigate their Infinite Campus, you're like, oh goodness. And it could be really overwhelming depending on like if one teacher is inputting 90 assignments a week versus like somebody who only inputs like 2 assignments a week. So those things to consider as well.
Thank you. All right, group 2, room 2.
We've said very similar things. Understanding why having it more broad would be beneficial just because it fits more people. But we do like that specific so that everyone has one vision and we're going towards the same thing and that there's consistency between different grade levels and consistencies between departments that are outlined by the school board policy.
Thank you. All right, room 3.
I can take this one. I think we started by kind of discussing, there was one, I don't have it in front of me right now, but something, and I don't believe it's in Valley View's policy, but about the if extra work is provided. And we kind of talked about if that's contradictory to some of the ideas that we're trying to work towards. So if we're allowing student extra work, but then there was some discussion about high school looks a little different when they do their, you have to, I don't remember what you said, quick catch up or turn around or something along those lines.
It's the quick recovery. So
quick recovery. Okay.
Yeah. So if a student has between a 50 and a 59% at the end of the semester, maybe they didn't turn in a paper that was due in October, they're given the opportunity to turn in that summative. But from my understanding, it's restricted to just the 50% above. And it's like within the first couple of weeks of January that they could then, even though they failed at, when grades were pulled on January 5th, they could still have it changed, provided they complete that summative.
Yeah, and then thank you for clarifying that. And then we had talked a little bit about a couple of specific lines that came out in Valley Views that were different than the others, was about a student shall not be retained when a remedial assistant has not been provided. And that there needs to be an arrangement of remedial assistance to ensure that a student isn't actually demonstrating adequate progress. And just kind of how we talked about how that links to MTSS structures and that need for intervention, especially at the younger grade levels, and putting those into place because we typically do not see students retained in elementary or middle.
Thank you. All right, room 4.
Basically had a similar conversation just around flexibility, basically how we're going to be needing to make tweaks to do what's best based on voice as we go, and being able to have a policy that allows us to do that in consultation with like all stakeholders' voices, but mid-year from one year to the next, fixing things that aren't perfect, that we kind of don't have that flexibility now, and that would be very helpful.
Absolutely. And you also made another point that perhaps it should include our non-negotiables so that we make sure that we are consistently that whatever decisions are made in administrative procedures, that they must still be aligned with our non-negotiables, which I think is really important. All right, so thank you for that. What we're going to do next time is we are going to start with this conversation and do the book study later, because we want to get this into a written form that includes the key components that are required by school code. and then any updates, modifications, additions that we want to make sure that we include. So, so we'll keep that in mind and we'll continue to do that next time, so that by the end of next meeting, we'll have a good, strong draft that will be ready to bring to the school board. And next time, we're also going to have a conversation about what we're going to bring to the school board, how we're going to share it with the school board, and what kinds of things we want to bring to them as a committee, so that we all can be positive representatives of the work, and so that we're very clear about how this being committee based and rather than a top-down decision. Make sense? All right. Any final thoughts before we wrap up tonight?
Just out of curiosity, like a quick thumbs up, sideways, or down about the meeting being remote. And however you feel, we like remote, definitely hate remote, or it could kind of go either way. Okay, like in most things, we don't have a consensus. Okay, cool.
But we have more thumbs up than any other. We have a couple of either way, and just a one or two. And I totally get that, you know, being in person is preferable. But when we think about our winter meetings and weather, that may be something we'll want to just keep in mind for 1 or 2 meetings.
Yeah, we were just thinking about basically, especially with snow, things like that, or if there's content that lends itself to a remote context versus an in-person context. So we wouldn't go away from in-person entirely, no matter what, but just since we tried this out, just we're curious how everyone kind of felt about it. So
yeah,
I have to say it's a lot easier for timing wise, this 3:30 to 5:30, just because of activities with kids. And
that's good to know.
I finally have one that drives now, but the other one, I probably can't just let her walk to places. It's frowned
Well,
upon.
but I also received a ton, like to that flip side, I received a ton of emails of, we have this activity, you know, like I'm a coach or this or this. So,
pros and
you know,
cons.
same thing. So,
Yeah.
There's never going to be a perfect answer ever.
Correct.
So we should probably meet from like 3:30 to 8:30, and that way everyone will be able
On a
to-
rotating basis, people come and go when they.
Exactly. There you go, Heather.
Yes. I put a link to
That's a hard no,
updated-
Adam.
Yeah. Right. I put a link to an updated exit slip for us. Hopefully this will be meaningful to you to share your feedback. Again, this is a reminder that we want to use the information that you give us in these exit slips to help us make better and better meetings. So, oh, wait, that should be.
Hey,
Let me
Margot, while you do the permission, just a real quick announcement to those who are on here, since we're talking quote unquote in person. That intro communication that you all helped draft, or principals will be sending that tomorrow to staff members, just about what our team has done so far, that we haven't made any decisions, what we've been learning, and our non-negotiables and things like that. So just a heads up.
Can you send that to me so I can report to the board on the 19th?
Yes, I absolutely.
Thank
will do
you.
that.
All right, try it again. It should work this time. Theoretically. I'm seeing some nods. So now it's working. You're able to get to it. Okay.
Yeah,
So if you
it's
just
working.
open it up and try to finish it within the next day or so, that would really be helpful to us. All right. Thank you all so much for being here, for your great conversation. I think we're really narrowing in on some really key critical points that are going to really help inform our decision making. And after, you know, between January and February, we're going to have recommendations for what we're going to be doing for the 23-24 school year. So we're getting close to that point. All right. Thank you guys. Enjoy your evening, and I won't see you before then. So Merry Christmas to all of you. Enjoy your winter break. Get some rest and have some fun.
Oh, you know what? We can send up, Deb, we'll send a follow-up email. Adrienne can follow up with the pages for the book study for January.
Okay.
Oh, I forgot about that.
They're in the slides, but Adrienne will remind everyone too.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
See everyone later.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank
Have a
you
good
again for
one.
being here. We'll check in tomorrow for our debrief, okay?
Yep, sounds good. Thanks.
All right, see you then. Bye-bye.